Bonjour, hello, and welcome to the FoliO Canada 400 celebration. My name is Dean Gabriel, and I've been a theatre practitioner for over 30 years, a budding scholar for 2. I am a Shakespeare geek, a first FoliO geek, and admittedly, an Emma Smith geek. I will be your host for this afternoon's conversation, and I'm speaking to you from Stratford, Ontario, Canada, Treaty 29 territory. I would like to let folks know that we will be recording this event and putting it together with greetings from our artistic directors, and included in our final edit will be all of the specific land acknowledgements from our participating companies. For today, I would like to acknowledge the occupation of Turtle Island and our home on native land. I would also like to share with you a living thought that was shared with me on a recent trip by the beings of the magical Gwai Hannes, or Haida Gwaii, and that is, everything depends on everything else. There's both a generosity and a responsibility in that thought. And certainly in theater and in publishing, certainly for the book we are discussing today, we know for a certainty that everyone depends on everyone else. This uniquely Canadian celebration of the 400th anniversary of the printing of Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies was inspired by a conversation I had in January of this year with Marcus Coles, creator of the FoliO 400 website, which I would encourage you all to visit if you have not yet. During our conversation, Marcus was unrestrainedly effusive and kept referring to the creative courage, the generosity of John Hemming and Henry Condell, to their stewardship, their friendship and sense of duty as the keepers, compilers, and perhaps editors of this book of plays. And Marcus also spoke to the debt of gratitude that we as Shakespeare practitioners and scholars of today owed to them. And so it was in that spirit of generosity and stewardship, of friendship and ensemble, we began to gather this celebratory circle across the country from coast to coast to coast. And here we are. Now, to introduce our interviewer for today's event, Amanda Kellock. Amanda is an actor, writer, and director from Montreal and has been working in professional theater for 15 years. Amanda took the helm of Repercussion Theater in 2015, but has performed and directed with the company since 2004. I can highly recommend Amanda's play, All Shall Be Well, developed during the pandemic with some of our circle participants here today. It is insightful, informative, and a lot of laughs, and perfect for an In the Park Shakespeare company. In April of 2024, Amanda will be directing the world premiere of Thy Woman's Weeds by Canadian genius Aaron Shields at the Centaur Theatre in Montreal. Amanda does theater to figure out what it means to be human and believes in theater's amazing capacity to change the world. Welcome, Amanda. Our guest of honor today is Professor Emma Smith. Professor Smith's work is on Shakespeare, on stage, in print, and wider culture. The professor is interested in how Shakespeare came to be so important. She has written 2 books on Shakespeare's first folio, The Making of Shakespeare's First Folio, the newest edition of which has just landed on my doorstep, and Shakespeare's First Folio, 4 Centuries of an Iconic Book. Professor Smith is also the editor of the Cambridge Companion to the First Folio. Her lectures and podcast Talking Shakespeare evolved into her seminal book, This is Shakespeare. I can also add that Professor Smith is one of the busiest and most generous people in Shakespeare studies in Shakespeare theater, and has dedicated her entire 23 to speaking to and about Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies. We are honored to have her join us today. Please welcome Professor Emma Smith. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dean. My goodness. What a lovely introduction. Hello, Canada. Hello, Emma. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's so wonderful to have you here.
It's fantastic to be here. It's such a thrill to see that list of the participating companies and that sense of your vast country and cultural work. It's amazing. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you've been talking about the folio a lot this year. Are you okay to keep going? It's still
Absolutely.
interesting?
Yeah, absolutely. There's always more. And people ask different things. People have come to it in different ways. Absolutely.
Okay, well, that's good because we've been compiling some questions from our colleagues across the country over the past few weeks, and I've been trying to distill it down. There's obviously so much we could talk about, much that we will, but I was thinking that I might start off the conversation by asking you how you would introduce Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies if you were going to talk about it as part of one of your approaching Shakespeare lectures, which I just adored. If anyone hasn't had the pleasure of listening to the lectures, Professor Smith, Emma, starts each one with a brief plot synopsis and a central question. And I think my favorite question was, just how sad is King Lear? Which seems like a cheeky question, but is wonderfully generative. So is that okay with you? Is that an okay way to start?
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, there are sort of two ways I would give a synopsis of this book. So, firstly, I would say this is a posthumously published collection of 36 plays divided between comedies, histories, and tragedies, half of which had not been previously published, and therefore it is the sole witness to plays like Macbeth, Twelfth Night, Julius Caesar, Tempest, and so on. So that would be a sort of a beginning of what is this object. But then I suppose the other thing I would say is this book comes out, 400th birthday this year, so 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death in 1616. Dean mentioned John Hemming and Henry Condell, who were fellow actors with Shakespeare in The Chamberlain's Men and then The King's Men. And they too are getting on a bit. This is, and this is a work which is both about the past and incredibly about the future. And I suppose how I would see the book is as the handover. It's almost that section of the track where the runners have to swap the baton, and we get the baton here. This is the end of Shakespeare, confined to, understood by the actors who had first known him, the theaters, the world that had created him. This is the gift into the future. This is where it all starts, I think. So it's an extraordinary moment which begins the kind of afterlife of Shakespeare, which is the life in which we are all living and working and creating.
And a question? Is there a question?
I guess the question would be, well, there are lots of questions, actually. There's a question about the bookishness, isn't there? Which is, what do we do with it? Given that we can get Shakespeare's plays on our phones, in our grandmother's editions, in the editions we used at school, in a typescript that we're working on for a show. There are thousands of ways to get Shakespeare's words, to get Shakespeare's texts. And so what does this old book have to tell us now? I guess that's the crucial question.
Yeah. Well, I love that second sort of version of what this book is all about. And I'd love to kind of go back to the creation of it, because I think for me, part of what's so amazing about this first folio is that it exists, that it actually got made. I mean, it was spearheaded, as you said, by two actors. They were also company managers, so clearly very organized people. And this is in no way a dig at actors. I'm an actor myself, but they weren't publishers. And this sort of collection of plays was a fairly new idea. I mean, Johnson, I guess, had published his own complete works a few years prior. Printing was new. By all accounts, this was a huge undertaking. And so what do you think, why was it so important for Hemming and Condell to gather and publish this collection of Shakespeare's plays?
Yeah, it's a hugely significant question. They are actors gathering the plays together, as you say, but they are also in partnership with publishers, with William and Isaac Jaggard, who own a print shop in London's Barbican, and they do the actual technical work of setting type and making print appear on pages. And a man called Edward Blunt, who was, I suppose, what we would now call the publisher. And Blunt is an interesting figure because he looks, for one thing, he publishes many, many fewer sermons than just about anybody else publishing at the time. The vast majority of what gets printed at this point is religious. That's actually the material that keeps the printing industry going. But Blunt is not really into that. And instead, he has a really extraordinary eye for works of literary value. It's he who publishes Montaigne's essays. He publishes the first edition of Don Quixote in English. He has a sense about what's going to be important. And I think his eye falls on Shakespeare in some way, and think that he wants to put his investment and his sort of curatorial stamp of approval, if you like, on Shakespeare. I think Hemming and Condell may well have been acting primarily on sort of emotional grounds. We see their names in Shakespeare's will in 1616. They're given money to buy mourning rings. And lots of people have felt that may have carried with it an explicit or an implicit command to make a real monument to Shakespeare, which would be gathering the works together. So I think there are lots of factors. There's an emotional factor which perhaps affects Hemming and Condell. There's a literary value factor which Blunt I think brings, but there is also something commercial. I mean, almost nobody publishes a book planning for it not to make money, or not to cover its costs at least. So part of what we see about this book is that it is attempting to create a market for itself in the act of appearing, because, as you say, it's actually by no means clear that people want to read even individual plays at this point. I love Succession, but doesn't mean I want the script. And whether people want to actually read these works, and whether the people who do are people who go to the theatre or people who don't, these are all sort of questions that publishers are working out. So you're absolutely right to ask the question. It's not self-evident, but I think there must be a convergence of different sort of impulses which bring this book into the world.
I mean, they even have to write in one of their sort of introductions, buy this book, criticize it if you want, but just buy it first.
That's right. Yeah. They're really nervous, actually, I think, about this being a success, being a commercial success. And we get a second edition of this book, which we don't talk about so much, in 1632, 9 years later. That's quite. I mean, that suggests that it's sold out in 9 years or 8 years, perhaps. But that's quite a long time to wait for your money, isn't it? To wait to get a profit. And there are certainly books that are published at the same time that get a second edition much quicker. So I think this is quite a slow burn of a book. I don't think it flies off the shelves, but I think it builds its own kind of readership and its own audience.
Yeah. And you mentioned the mourning rings and the Shakespeare's will, and I know there has been some sort of discussion recently, I guess, about the fact that this collection is published posthumously, and is it published without Shakespeare's consent? But and I know our friends at Shakespeare on the Saskatchewan in particular were asking a question about that. And so other than that kind of implicit, the element of the will, do you think there's any sense that Shakespeare would have wanted this type of thing to exist?
It's a really good question. So for some scholars, some people who'd be sitting here would say, yes, when Shakespeare retires from the theatre, what he is doing is working up his own plays for publication. He has that in mind. And Hemmings and Condell do say in the first folio, we all wish that he had lived to do this himself, which might have suggested that he was aiming to do it, but didn't get around to it. On the other hand, that view of authorship doesn't seem really to work in the theatre at this time. So these scripts belonged to the theatre; they didn't belong to the author. They are seen as, I think, properties for performance rather than sort of documents for private study or private publication. And I think Shakespeare's biography is so difficult to get a hold of. It's really impossible to get a hold of. But there's only one thing I feel really confident about Shakespeare's biography, I think. And this came very clear to me when we talked a lot about the theatres being closed for plague during his time, and we've talked about that over the last couple of years. And we can see early in Shakespeare's career in 1593, before he has really established himself as a theatre writer, the theatres all close. And he writes these two fabulously successful poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. He gets aristocratic patronage for them. They come out in lots and lots of editions. They're clearly really, really popular. Lots of people cite them. He has really made it as a poet in 1593. He has not made it as a playwright. And yet, when the theatres reopen, he's back. He's back in that world with all its collaborations and the decentering of the author, if you like, which is so different from narrative poetry. So in a way, I think perhaps Shakespeare was not particularly interested in gathering this collection together, and if he had been, he could have probably got on with it quite a bit earlier. He doesn't. So I suppose what's important to me and what's permissive for me is that the collection is posthumous. And so it's one remove from Shakespeare already, and that makes it easier for us to take it where we need to take it.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard you talk about this notion of the creation of the first folio being kind of an act of permission, of inviting engagement with the work. But I can certainly tell you that as an artistic director and as a director, and I think many of my colleagues would agree, I definitely encounter people for whom there is a right way to do Shakespeare. And they like to send emails, in particular, if you've done something that is not the way to do Shakespeare. And so I wonder what you say to those people.
Yeah, I get those too. I said that Shakespeare was sometimes a bit too long and that could usefully be cut. And this, I did get some incredible letters. It was as if I had, who knew that Shakespeare would arouse such highly defended champions. I suppose what I say is we have begun to explore the ways that Shakespeare himself adapted his work for different circumstances. So where we have two early versions of a particular play, let's take King Lear. We used to be thinking in the past, well, which is the true one? Which was really Shakespeare's? How has this one got scrambled and got transmitted? We had this idea of bad quartos. These were these early single play editions. We had lots of kind of ideas and frameworks to try to stabilize the text, to say this is the right one, this is the authoritative one. And that came from a world where we just didn't think about theatre. Because, I mean, anybody who works with scripts in the theatre, in a revival, going back to a play that perhaps had a successful run at a festival 5 years ago, looking at it now, thinking that's not going to work so well, or this needs updating, or we haven't got that actor anymore. So that, which was all their shtick, that really needs to change, and we need to give some space. You know, all those theatrical and many more, those theatrical kind of decisions. I think, you know, Shakespeare was a man of the theatre. I think he was absolutely into that. And so I think the task of reviving these plays, keeping these plays in the repertory in some way, it has always required some touching up, sometimes large scale, sometimes small scale. So I feel, you know, Shakespeare is a theatre man. I think he would completely endorse that. You know, what do you need to do to get this play on? You know, and in his world, you need to say, actually, if we're going to do this before the Scottish king, let's not have that comedy Scotsman. Should we just cut the comedy Scotsman? Yeah, let's just cut the comedy Scotsman. I think the same, to be honest, I think the same is true to say, you know, do we need that remark about washing the Ethiop white? Does it really add? No, I don't think we do. It's the same as the comedy Scotsman. We just don't need it. It can go. So I feel I'm absolutely cool with that. And I think it is, moreover, I think it's absolutely our obligation. I think it's really important that these plays live. And that's been my main worry in a way about First Folio year, that sometimes the First Folio itself can look like the authoritative version. And in fact, it tries to present itself as the authoritative version, but it isn't. It is just a moment when these scripts have got frozen in a particular form and put into print.
Yeah. And that's part of kind of what's so amazing about it as well, in terms of Shakespeare's, that will always exist. It's almost an argument for making adjustments to the local.
Yeah, do you know, I completely agree. Actually, it's always going to be there, isn't it? So it doesn't, you know, it's not harmed by what we do, what we do to it. And there are all kinds of moments in Shakespeare's history where his works have survived through adaptation rather than through the, you know, through the original Shakespearean copy. All through the 18th and into the 19th century in Britain, these were plays which existed as very, very heavily adapted versions for the tastes and the kind of the world of, you know, so that's how Shakespeare's reputation was maintained, not necessarily by absolutely not by sticking to every word that he wrote as if it's some kind of scripture.
No, exactly. And then it becomes more of a conversation with Shakespeare. And I think in so many ways, he's a really good conversation partner. And that's part of the reason it continues to be so interesting. As you're saying, you know, you read an adaptation and you suddenly go, oh, I want to go back to, and you realize there's such a wonderful dialogue between these materials and intertextual sort of conversation happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I think conversation has got to be key to it. And yeah, like you, I think Shakespeare would be a good conversationalist. I think we would disagree about things. I think he would have sort of strong views about the ways to do things, or what was appropriate or not. But I think he would be there for the conversation, because I think fundamentally his is a collaborative intelligence. And a creative intelligence. What's interesting about the First Folio is that there are lots of ways in which perhaps to turn these plays into a book, that sense of collaboration gets, I think to some extent gets edited out. And what we get instead, you know, we get, if people feel they don't know anything about this book, they do know that picture of Shakespeare that's on the front with a bald head and a big wide white collar. It's an attempt to say this is the work of one mind or one bald head, rather than this is the work of scores and scores of theatre makers across different places and times.
Although one of the things I love so much about the folio is some of that prefatory material, that wonderful poem from Ben Jonson, and the list of actors that are in the plays. And so and there's something about those elements that really do hint at the community that it took to actually make these plays in the first place. So I wonder what are some of your favorite bits from those prefatory materials?
Yeah, so there's all this material that if you look at an online First Folio, you can look at our local one, the Bodleian Library in Oxford, but there are lots of others too, and you sort of turn through the pages. You're right, there's a preface by Hemming and Condell to two noblemen who are the dedicatees of the volume. There's their address to the reader that we've already been talking about, to the great variety of readers. There are a few poems of commendation about Shakespeare and about these works. There's a list of the actors. Most of the actors in The King's Men, a sort of running list from Shakespeare himself, who is at the head of the list, through to the actors who are still working in The King's Men in the 1620s when this book is produced. One thing we've come to think about this prefatory material is that it has a slight air of disorganization about it and a slight air of randomness. Lots of scholars, once you ask the question, why was this book of plays by the chief playwright of The King's Men not dedicated to the king?
Yeah,
it's really hard to answer why it wasn't. And why didn't Thomas Middleton or John Fletcher or any of the other playwrights who'd worked with Shakespeare and who were sort of around and about, why didn't they write any of these poems? So it's a curious it's a curious kind of selection. And Jonson himself, Ben Jonson, whose poem is, as you say, is a wonderful poem, but Jonson is the absolute rent-a-quote of the 1620s. If you went, and in fact, he writes a poem himself saying, perhaps I am a bit, bit too free with my praise for things, but this time I really mean it. But he says about Thomas Coriat, a Jacobean traveller who writes an extraordinarily long and actually very entertaining travel account, that his name will live, as long as we have eyes to see. Not so. So he was right about Shakespeare, but he did sometimes overclaim for other people too. So I do like that material. Now, just to answer your question, I think the bit that I most enjoy, because it tells us something really, really fascinating about the way this book is put together, is the fact that in the catalogue of plays included, there is one play missing, Troilus and Cressida. And I love it when, as in many copies, owners at different times have written in Troilus and Cressida in its place at the top of the history plays. And the reason I like that is it tells us something about the behind the scenes negotiations for the rights to plays that had previously been printed. It seemed as if they weren't going to get the rights to Troilus and Cressida after all. And so what the publishing team of the First Folio do is to bring in a plan B. And plan B, I don't know if anyone on this call has presented this, plan B is Timon of Athens. And it's clear that had Troilus and Cressida come in the normal time frame, we would not have had Timon of Athens in the book. But more than that, we wouldn't know that we didn't have it because there's no other reference to that play. So it would become a kind of unknown, in Donald Rumsfeld's lovely phrase. And I love the window that opens into a sense that there might have been other plays, perhaps on the periphery of Shakespeare's canon in one way or another, that could be brought forward if key plays couldn't be got in for some reason or another, but otherwise might not come forward. And we know there are a couple of Shakespeare plays that we have effectively lost. The play Love's Labour's one, and the collaboration Cardenio, based on Don Quixote. And there could have been more. Perhaps there are more. Perhaps there are more that we just don't even know about.
Well, I think this is maybe a good moment to bring in, we've recorded some questions from our friends across the country. And so this first question is from one of our colleagues, Mary Hartman, who's the Director of Education at Bard on the Beach in Vancouver, BC, all the way on the West Coast. So here's Mary's question.
Identified Shakespeare's incompleteness, the sheer permissive gappiness of the plays as a defining factor, allowing our own imaginations to fill in the holes left by the writing. Of course, there were so many other people involved in the making of the first folio: the scribes, the printers, the compositors, Shakespeare's colleagues. Do you believe these influences contribute to or complicate Shakespeare's gappiness?
Oh, thanks, Mary. That's a really great question. I think these other factors, these other agents in Shakespeare's works, complicate and extend the gappiness that's sort of intrinsic to Shakespeare. I suppose when I wrote that, Mary's very nicely quoting from my book, This is Shakespeare, I was trying to think about the way that we sometimes are looking for answers about Shakespeare's plays. We're looking to try and work out what the answer is. And I was trying to say instead, I think it's the fact that the question is so important. So why does Iago do what he does in Othello? The answer to that, A, we don't know, and B, it wouldn't be very interesting. But the question is fabulously interesting and generative. And we know that it's a question that Shakespeare has kind of hardwired into the play. And the answers have not been hardwired into the play. So they're there for us to provide. I think that some of the things that we need to do is to just work out what's going on at the level of the line or the level of the word. There's a great example of this in Measure for Measure, where Angelo, the uptight, puritanical governor, is described twice as the Prenzy Angelo. Prenzy Angelo. We don't know what Prenzy means. Should we change it? Should it be a word that we don't know what it means? There are lots of words in Shakespeare that are hard to understand. Perhaps it's not necessary. Maybe that was a printer's error. It's quite often suggested that this is somebody looking at handwriting and having a best go at a word, even though it's a word that that doesn't really convince us. So that might be an example where at a tiny level, printers, press workers have created another kind of conundrum that adds to that sense that Shakespeare is all about the what, asking what or asking why.
It makes me think too about wasn't there a very young apprentice working?
Yes. Yeah, poor John Leeson, who signs his apprentice papers with the Jaggards in November 1622. So he has his first year of 7 as an apprentice. That modern idea that it's 10,000 hours to learn, to do something. I mean, he is in his first 1,000 or so hours during the time he's working on the first folio. And one of the great things he has given us is a sense actually of how good experienced press men were, and how difficult it is as a job to do. So we can see John Leeson's work being corrected a bit and overseen a bit more. But what no one seems to have done for the first folio is what would be standard with a modern book, which is to check it against copy. Right. So to say, this is what you have typeset. Is it what was written on your copy, or have you sort of misread or garbled it in some way? the evidence we have about error correction is really what we would call typos. You can just look at the page and know that that's a mistake, that word's wrongly spelt, or that letter is in the wrong place. Yeah, so definitely printers, definitely, the print format introduces ambiguities and possible errors or rereadings that we can't really quite even pinpoint with absolute clarity, because we don't have anything to compare them with. We only have Shakespeare's work because of print. So really, we should just be enormously thankful to them.
It makes me think that, sometimes we in the theater, directors, actors, acting coaches, we can get terribly excited by the folio and some of the real nuance of the language, as though Shakespeare himself is giving us direction through the text. And so Jennifer Parr at Vagabond Night asks, do you think what we find useful is actually just rhetorical orthographic standards of the period, rather than Shakespeare intuitively giving us acting clues through the punctuation, capitalizations, and spellings in the play texts?
Yeah, Jennifer, I don't think Shakespeare is giving us acting clues through those elements of the text, and I think that because the very few examples we have of handwritten play scripts, there's a manuscript play called Thomas More, the Book of Thomas More, which many people think has some of Shakespeare's handwriting in, has drawn in the big hitting playwright to try and make this very problematic play work, and to do a couple of big arias. Really, that's what he does, some big set piece speeches. Anyway, if we look at that manuscript, it has no punctuation at all. And it's almost certain that much of the punctuation that we see in the folio has been put in by in the print shop, as a way of sort of managing the text. So I don't think Shakespeare is giving us those clues, but I think if actors find those clues, that is itself as valuable as if they've actually been left there. So I think that some of the work I've seen on folio text work in the rehearsal room, which has really wanted to think about, how does this capital letter help us understand what's important in this sentence? I think that's often been immensely productive. So I think people have their own skill set and their own ways of finding the clues in the text, and that seems to me enough. We don't need to add that Shakespeare sort of put them there for you to find them.
Right. Yeah. Thinking back to sort of the folio as a whole, and the sheer number of plays that would have been just lost to time if we didn't have them. I think it's 18 or so plays that we just wouldn't have. We have another question. This one is from our friend Rodrigo at Shakespeare in the Ruins in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So here's Rodrigo.
I'm Rodrigo. I have a couple of cheeky questions that are connected, and although a bit cheeky, they might reveal something about our personal attachment to Shakespeare, and therefore might mean something greater than just being cheeky. Would you still consider Shakespeare to be this big a deal if the 18 plays we got in the folio were lost to time, and if you were placed in the tough job of being the folio's first editor, and you simply had to remove 2 plays from the folio, just ruthlessly cut them out because of unforeseeable circumstances, which ones would you choose to delete?
Rodrigo, they're brilliant questions, and in fact, your second one reminds me that I pitched a program to BBC Radio, which was going to be about the folio, and it was 4 programs about what we would have lost if we didn't have these plays, and the final program was going to be, but who cares about the first part of Henry VI, or who cares about Timon of Athens, or who cares about All's Well That Ends Well. Now, I'll be making enemies because there will be people on the call who will be able to make a kind of wonderful case for any of those plays, and of course, because we've got them, we can do that. But let's go back to the first part of Rodrigo's question. I absolutely do not think Shakespeare would look as significant in our world today if we didn't have the folio. So we would still have all kinds of Shakespeare plays. We would have Hamlet, we would have King Lear, plays that we think are wonderfully important and significant. We would have Much Ado About Nothing, we'd have The Merchant of Venice, and so on. So we would still have a large number of wonderful plays. But 2 things. One is that Shakespeare would look more like a history writer. So the history plays are the ones that have already mostly been printed. And I think somebody whose work seems to major on the intricacies of medieval English kings probably would not have looked like a natural candidate to go global. So I think there is something about how the canon would look with those the folio only plays missing. But I think there's also something about the folio itself as a collection. It's a book which has survived in actually quite large numbers, and that is always the case with big books. I mean, you may know that yourself. That you've got big books, maybe art catalogs or something like that. That kind of, because they're big, you just put them away on a shelf and you don't really look at them very often. Whereas you've got little books that you look at a lot or that are really important to you, and they can be almost falling apart from use. So the folio as an object definitely secures Shakespeare's reputation at some crucial points. The one I really enjoy is when Charles II comes back to the throne of England after the Cromwellian Protectorate. The theatre is restored along with the monarchy, and Charles issues an order that the theatre needs to get going, kind of by next week. And there's a panic. Nobody's been writing a play. Nobody's been acting. Nobody's been doing any of these things. And we know that Edward Killigrew, one of the noblemen who is tasked with getting the theatre up and running, we know he has a copy of the first folio. And we know that that's where he kind of looks, think, my God, what am I doing? Let's get this book down. And he finds Twelfth Night, which he realizes will be a great hit in a new age of actresses. And that a play where a woman wears men's clothing means that she is revealing all kinds of parts of her body that female clothing never reveals, and that this will go down brilliantly in the Restoration Court. So there's something about just the physical presence of the book which has provided a continuity of Shakespeare's reputation across time. So I love the question about what would we get rid of, and although it's sort of painful, you can always make a case about why you should keep them. I think we have struggled to really like Timon of Athens, haven't we? We've struggled to really like maybe All's Well That Ends Well as well. We've struggled to really like King John, although I do really like it. We've slightly struggled to like Henry VIII. Maybe these are ones that in the sort of balloon debate could be lost.
I know. I think there's an argument too about Two Gents, except the bit with the dog.
Oh, Two Gents. Yeah, the dog is good. That's right, but perhaps not so.
Yeah, the rest of it.
Much the ending. Yeah, quite.
Yeah, we'll just keep the dog. Get rid of the rest of the play.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. We could maybe mash the dog in with somewhere else.
Yes, give Malvolio a dog in Twelfth Night, and then we're fine.
I think that might be the making of Malvolio. Perhaps that's what you've worked out. This is what will sort him out.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's something too about the breadth of just the sheer scope of the plays as a whole, and how they sort of end up speaking to each other, because they're so full of such strong points of view, often conflicting points of view, even within the same, scene. But then that multiplied across the whole canon of his plays. There's something about that that I think would be difficult to sort of be as compelled by if we just had the handful.
And I think that the folio's title that Dean read out, Master William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories and Tragedies, I think it is alluding to a sort of, every play you would ever need is here. This has extraordinary range, different moods, different time, settings and so on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which brings me to the fact that they chose to organize them into those three very clear categories, even though it really kind of feels like Shakespeare at the end of his life is starting to, he's always kind of pushing the boundaries of categories, but in particular at the end, there's so many plays that kind of defy categorization. So, but is this just kind of a necessary bit of PR on the part of Hemming and Condell?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? As we look at those categories now, or as we've looked at them in more modern period, it's comedy that's turned out to be a problem. So that the range of plays, the folio includes The Tempest and the Winter's Tale and Measure for Measure and The Taming of the Shrew. In comedies, along with As You Like It and Much Ado About Nothing and Twelfth Night. So it has romantic comedy, but it has what some people call tragicomedy, or people have called problem plays. In some ways, these are broader categories maybe than we are used to, and that breadth I think can be helpful. That not all comedies are funny or light-hearted, even, and not all comedies need to end in marriage. So maybe a Shakespearean, or at least an early modern sense of genre, is a bit more elastic than sometimes we allow it. But yeah, I think there is definitely a sense of organizing these plays into categories which are roughly equal in size. The history plays have been reorganized, majorly reorganized, to produce Trevor Nunn very nicely called this Shakespeare's box set. They've been reorganized to kind of to produce a serial. It's not clear that the other categories have been organized in quite such a hands-on way. But there's something about PR, I think, in those categories. And of course, they're not Shakespearean. They're not necessarily done by Shakespeare. And I can absolutely imagine him saying, as you've said, Amanda, this is exactly what I've been trying to get away from.
Yeah.
You've put them back into these boxes, and the whole point was that I was breaking out of those, particularly at the end of my career.
Yeah. Even Cymbeline right at the end there, is it?
Yeah, right at the end of the Tragedies. Yeah, mad.
Yeah, you think? I guess two people
yeah,
die.
The title looks like it. Maybe they weren't all that on top of what was in it. Hard to know. Hard to know.
Well, there did, as you said, there was very little proofreading done, so there does seem to be a sort of sense of just go, just get it out there.
Yeah, this is a book which we revere for all kinds of reasons, but it is not an absolutely beautiful bit of printing. And you can see, comparing this with other things that are printed by the same print house, you can see this is not their best work. This is not their full deluxe service. This is a more workaday job. The print is a bit too small. I can perhaps say that now. I have to wear reading glasses myself and think this is not my eyes. It's the print is too small. But yes, the pictures got small. But I think that all of that is about sort of cramming it in, getting it done, there is quite a lot of pragmatism in the preparation of this book that we idealize, and that's one of the tensions maybe in what we hope for from it and what it actually presents.
Right. Yeah. Okay, we've got another question. This is from Kay Wong at Driftwood Theatre in Ontario. And part of what I love about this question is it's such a producer question because we're always looking for new material. So here's Kay's question.
My name's Kay, and I'm a producer for Driftwood Theatre. I wanted to ask if there's any credible evidence of the existence of some of Shakespeare's lost works, such as Love's Labour's Won. And if so, why would they be omitted from the first folio?
It's a really great question. So the plays that are omitted from the first folio, really only 2 have absolutely secured their place in the canon, and that's Pericles and Two Noble Kinsmen. So neither of those plays is in the first folio, but most all modern collected editions of Shakespeare would have those plays in. And of course, there's a whole penumbra of plays which may or may not be Shakespearean, Arden of Faversham, Edward III, what else? Edmund Ironsides, various kinds of plays sort of talked about Spanish parts of the Spanish tragedy, maybe. So there's a lot of talk about Shakespeare as a collaborator in other plays, but those plays also don't have the authentication of being in the folio. But your question is about sort of missing plays. So we think we've got evidence that Love's Labour's Won did exist, even that it may have existed in print, and what's happened to it, who knows? Maybe the story I told about Timon of Athens could be extended to suggest that there are other plays that maybe Hemmings and Condell know are not solely by Shakespeare. Maybe they're trying to manage a sort of solo volume and to leave out work that seems to be collaborative. Timon of Athens, we mostly think, is collaborative with Middleton. Pericles and Two Noble Kinsmen, the ones that are not in the folio, were collaborative. So maybe they left them out on those for those reasons. And I suppose the other thing about the Troilus and Cressida story, which suggests that they couldn't get the rights because the person who owned the rights was not willing to sell them. That could also, we've tended to think that things didn't get into the first folio because they weren't good enough. But it's possible, at least possible, I think, that Pericles didn't get into the first folio because it was too expensive to get the rights for it, because it was too popular. So that would sort of turn over that line of that line of argument. So yeah, Love's Labour's Won is the great prize for us to try and find. For some theatre makers and some scholars, it's an alternative name for a play we've already got. Much Ado About Nothing is quite often put in that place, but I think it is a lost play. We may have little bits of it in the books of quotations, which were really popular in the period. So printed books of quotations, which were for time poor people to make it look as if they read a lot or knew a lot. And lots of those quotations have never been identified. So they must be part of larger things which have been lost. So there may be bits and pieces of it, but it's a very, very tantalizing mystery.
Hello, Dean.
Hello. Hey, folks. We are at our 5 minute, and I'm just wondering if you have any final questions or thoughts.
I do have one last question for you, Emma, which is a bit of a two-parter. But I said earlier, and I think it's become extremely clear that one of the things that's so wonderful about everything you do is that you keep theater at the center of this conversation about Shakespeare. And I know you've worked with theater companies and with theater people. And I was just wondering if your experience working with people in the theater has impacted the way you think about Shakespeare. And connected to that, what, as a final sort of thought, you might think is, what is the most useful for people in the theater in terms of the first folio?
So, I mean, working with theatre makers is an extraordinary experience for me. It's often about, you know, very different priorities. It's been helpful for me because one of my sort of critical trainings is to say, well, this line could mean this, or could mean this, or could mean this. And, you know, an actor will say, yeah, okay, but what do I mean? You know, I can't really, if I can try and convey all that, nobody will understand what I'm saying because it won't seem as if I understand it. And that's been actually a very helpful way for me to sort of rethink a bit some of my go-to sort of strategies. I had a brilliant experience working on As You Like It, which is a play I struggled to really love. I think there are lots of fascinating things about it, but I've struggled to love it. I mean, it's a play where nothing really happens. And that can be great, but it can also, you know, struggle a bit, I think. And I worked with a brilliant theatre company where I talked a lot to the two actors playing the comic roles, Touchstone and Jaques. And we came to an idea that As You Like It was the play. Who knows if this is true or not, but it was actually a really interesting thing to think about. That As You Like It was the play where Will Kemp, the comic actor, had left the Chamberlain's Men. And As You Like It is a kind of audition play for some different actors to have a go at being comic in their own, you know, one is a bit more of a Kemp ripoff and the other is a different kind of model of humor. And that there's sort of a doing turns, and maybe there's a bit of audience feedback about, you know, how this is working. And it really sort of helped me think about some set pieces in As You Like It. Touchstone is talking about the orders of sort of fencing, or and you think, oh God, this takes a long time, you know, what's actually going on? But it was much easier to see it when you thought, aha, this is a set piece. This is an audition piece, actually. Can you make this funny? So that was completely revelatory, and I've had lots of experiences. I've been really fortunate to have lots of experiences like that. I've loved. It's been an enormous privilege to work with theatre makers. What theatre makers can do with the folio, I think, is the thing that you're all already doing, which is to take seriously the injunction to take the plays forward. You know, is to be in that receiving section of the track and pick up the baton and you know, run where you want, or where your community wants, or your theatre wants. That seems to me the thing that we need to keep doing. And I think the folio, I think of it as a sort of transmission device, actually, rather than a thing in itself. It's a wonderful thing in itself, but for most of us, that's not going to be where what matters. What matters is that it has transmitted these plays to us with this extraordinary permission.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Emma. Thank you, Dean, for putting this all together. And thanks to all of our colleagues out there who sent questions. And I'm sure we could talk for another 3 hours and not run out of things to talk about. So thank you so much.
At the very least. Yeah, thank you all for joining us and for joining our circle. Our deepest thanks to Emma for her generosity in joining us for this historic conversation, to Amanda Kellogg for all of her work and focus, to Nicholas Lindsay, our broadcast coordinator and guardian angel, also to the FoliO 400 website and Marcus Coles for the inspiration, and to the huge supporters of this event, Kay Wong from Driftwood Theatre Group, and Bard on the Beaches, Dean Paul Gibson and Mary Hartman, both gems. Also Joy Wishart at the Stratford Festival, and finally to my heart, my wife, Marcel Fauché. Thanks. That's all, folks. Please take care.